everyone. You are listening to Incorruptible Mass. Our mission here is to help you transform state politics. We know that together we can make Massachusetts policy reflect the needs of the vast majority of the residents in our beautiful state. And today we are going to be talking housing with an amazing housing expert. We're going to get the skinny on a lot of housing policies that we, really need and are unfortunately unable to pass locally in Massachusetts. So we're going to touch on HDIP, which we talked a little bit about last time. We're going to talk about rent control. We're going to talk about the transfer fee. We'll talk about right to counsel, eviction ceiling, TOPA. We're going to at least touch on some of these policies. But before we do, I'm going to introduce our regular co-host, Jonathan Cohn. Jonathan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Jonathan Cohn, he is an activist based out of Boston who's been doing work in different issue and electoral campaigns for coming on a decade in Massachusetts, which always feels wild to say.
It is wild to say. Fantastic. And thanks for your work. I'm Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. Super engaged in local politics, kind of in different cities across the country for 7 years probably. And then state politics with this podcast and other things. And we are so excited today to have Mark Martinez on. Mark, if you want to introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about yourself and the organization that you work with, if you're okay with that, and the work that you do, and then we'll dive right into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Mark Martinez. I am a housing attorney with the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute, which is a statewide anti-poverty nonprofit / legal aid support organization. And so we do really a mixture of policy, advocacy, mostly at the state level, at least in the housing unit. Some of our other work is certainly more on the federal level, but the housing unit in particular, mostly state level work. And then, help with support and training for our legal aid partners that are really on the ground every day, helping, impacted individuals, usually low income.
Fantastic and amazing, very important work that you're doing. So we do want to dive into a lot of these housing policies. I think we're going to start with the HDIP policy that we talked about a little bit last time. Before we do, I just want us to cover for a quick second the fact that housing policies locally most housing policies cannot be passed by city councils and mayors, that it has to get passed on to the state level for permission. And if you want to talk just for like a couple brief sentences about that to kind of lay the groundwork of why all of this legislation is so difficult to pass at the state level.
Yeah, absolutely. So Massachusetts, we're a home rule state, right? And what that means is certain powers are delegated to cities and towns to be able to govern themselves and pass their own policies. But there are certain policies that you have to get permission from the state. And one of those are really anything that governs the landlord-tenant relationship and any relationships around like real estate transactions is something that cities and towns have to get permission directly from the state from. And so really what that means is, a city like Boston can, to use a real world example, can decide to pass an ordinance to implement rent control in the city of Boston, but that doesn't mean that it's done. It doesn't mean that the city of Boston has rent control. It means that you have to then go to the state and get the approval of the entire state house. It has to go through the process the way that any other bill would. And the complications there are, even if you do the work in a city like Boston to get a progressive city council, which is something that we've done in Boston, worked for a really long time to get a city council that is majority progressive, majority people of color. But then it goes to the state house that is none of those things, that is not majority progressive, that is nowhere near majority people of color. And we have to get their permission. And so that means that the representative from Pittsfield has to give Boston the okay. Yeah. To do what they want to do. Pittsfield just came to mind. There was no shade at Rep. Trisha Farley-Bouvier, to be clear. I really enjoy working with that rep, but Pittsfield was just the furthest place I could think of from Boston.
I just take it on this. What's always so jarring to me, and I kind of point that out and make when we're talking about this, is that sometimes sometimes we'll see it in some deep red state where the Republican governor and Republican legislature try to take away kind of more liberal cities' ability to pass their own laws. And then people in Massachusetts will rightfully be like, wow, that's terrible. I can't believe those horrible conservatives in that terrible conservative state would do such a thing. And it's like, that's been law for decades here in Massachusetts.
That's exactly right. And then the other little groundwork that I'm sure does not need to be laid, but I'm going to lay it anyway, is in case you've been hiding under a rock for a long time, we're in an incredible housing crisis. Like, it's insane. It's skyrocketing costs of both rent and housing purchase prices. It is just becoming impossible for people to pay their rent and afford, just the amount that costs you to afford to live is increasing so much because of rental prices, that we're in a real crisis. And so a lot of this legislation we're talking about is attempting to solve that problem. So with that little bit of groundwork, we would love to ask you about HDIP, what the policy is, what it's trying to solve, how it works, and then a little bit about, what maybe it is not able to solve.
And quickly kind of tag in for some of the context. If folks remember on our last episode, we were talking about how the Senate included a greater funding for this program, the Housing Development Incentive Program, as a part of their tax package. And that they had billed it very clearly as, look at us, we're doing our tax reform in a holistic way. We're putting more money into this kind of development incentive program, and also rejected amendments to create kind of like an accountability and affordability requirements. So just want to take it over. We'd love to hear about what even is this program?
Yeah, so HDIP is a housing development incentive program, right? And so as the name might suggest, it's a program designed to incentivize the development of housing. And so what it is, it's a tax break, right? It is a tax break for private developers in gateway cities to develop almost exclusively market rate housing. And it's really as simple as that. That's what this program does. And so what the governor proposed and what the Senate then followed through on in their tax package was an expansion of this program. It's a relatively new program. There was a limit, and still is a limit, on how much you could give out in tax credits every year, and the Senate bill would expand that, right? Expand it to the tune of about $300 million over the next 10 years, right? So that's $300 million more dollars in tax credits. And I think one of the things that doesn't get really talked about, like, people kind of think of tax credits as not like real dollars or not real monetary things because it's not an allotment, it's not a line item, but that's $300 million of taxpayer dollars that essentially aren't being collected, or you really can just describe it as being spent, right? That's money. If it's money that you can't use, it might as well be money spent, right? It's money gone. And so what they're talking about over the next 10 years is an additional $300 million to subsidize, right? That's what it is. We can call it a tax credit. It's a subsidy to private developers to develop market rate. And I would even say market rate is a misnomer. When you look at some of the units being developed with HDIP, right? This is luxury housing, right? We're talking about almost $3,000 a month studios in Worcester, right? Something that not too long ago you would have been laughed out of town for suggesting, right? $5,000, $6,000 a month apartments in Malden, right? And so these aren't even, I don't even think market rate is the correct terminology for a lot of what's being built here, or maybe for a lot, right? There is certainly, market rate, but there's also a good number of what I would describe as just luxury apartments being built with taxpayer dollars, with no requirement for affordability, right? And that's the other issue here, is that there's no requirement for any level of affordability. And so,
not just affordability, but what's being built. It's like one bedroom and studio.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that's the other thing, right? You're really not building things for families, right? This is not a place where families are going to live, right? Beyond just most families not being able to afford the rents in these places. It's literally not enough bedrooms, right? Exactly. Like Jordan said, this is 2 and 3 bedroom apartments, studios, 1 bedroom apartments, right? These are not designed for families. These are not designed for low income people, certainly not low income families. And again, right, no requirement for affordability. And I think, right, the underpinning here that they rely on is this idea that we have to build housing. And they're correct. We do have to build housing. 1000%, right? We do have a shortage here, right? That's just a fact. But we talk about it as just like the most simple supply and demand of like, oh, we need, or the number that they like to throw out, we need 200,000 units. But there's really no conversation about what do those units look like, how many bedrooms are they going to be, who are they built for, are they going to be affordable, who are they going to be affordable to? And this idea, right, this kind of trickle down economics idea of housing, that if we just build enough market rate housing, the affordability is going to kind of trickle down, is one that I certainly don't subscribe to. Sure, we need to build some market rate housing. I'm not opposed to building market rate housing, but a significant amount of that needs to be affordable, right? There's a report that gets put out every year by the National Low Income Housing Project called the GAP, right? That focuses specifically on the lowest income individuals, right? And we are short, I don't have the number in front of me, but right, it's hundreds of thousands of units for the lowest income people.
175,000. So we need 200,000 units, but 175,000 of them need to be for low income people.
Exactly. And so, right, when this idea, right, because the idea of this trickle down is that like, oh, if you build market rate housing, people will get out of affordable housing and free that up for the people that need it. There's probably some level of truth to that, right? There's some research to back that up. But right, I would posit that the opposite is probably more true, right? You have people living in market rate housing that can afford it, driving up the competition for that market rate housing. And if we built them housing that they could actually afford to live in, and they moved into that, then it would free up, right, this other stuff, this market rate housing that they like to make us believe is so scarce that we just have to build hundreds of thousands more units of it.
And I think that even when there have been studies that you do end up seeing the fact that like any positive impact it has is just very slow in terms of if you're like that construction can bring down, like the new stuff can bring down rents, but it's not like if you're in a crisis and people are at risk for like being priced out now, that doesn't help them.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And yeah, I would love to now we've heard some pretty wonderful information about why this is maybe not the best policy that we could have if our goal is really to create more housing for the people who are unable to find something that allows them to live, to have a style of living here with the price of living, including rent, that's not going to solve that problem, right? It's not at least the best policy to solve that problem. So we would love to hear from you. You do all this housing work on many different policy issues, and we would love for you to just give us a rundown of some of the things that like either keep people in their houses, or that build more affordable housing, or that, do other things that can allow us to provide housing for people that does not break the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's lots of things, right? So I think of the kind of solution to the housing crisis in a couple different steps, right? First and foremost, absolutely, we need to build a lot of housing, and we need to make sure it's affordable, right? And I can talk about some policies that ensure that. But right, the thing that they say all the time is, right, the conference committee, right, they're in the conference committee for the budget right now. They could come back tomorrow and decide that they're going to put all $53 billion of the state budget into building affordable housing, right? They could do it. They could just say, we're going to do it. It's going to take decades, right, to build that housing. That doesn't happen overnight. And so while we are pursuing that, and while people are focused on that, there are the things that we need to do to keep people in their homes now. Because people are getting forced out of their homes now, forced out of Massachusetts now, it's not going to help them if Massachusetts is affordable in a decade, right? They're gone. They've set up lives other places. All right. And that community has already been disrupted. Those lives have already been uprooted. And so it's, what do we do now? Let's keep people in their homes now while we pursue this other solution that some people tell us is the only and ultimate solution, right? Which of course I don't agree with. And so if we want to kind of take that bit by bit, right? Like right now, top of my mind, and I think top of most people's minds when they talk about housing, is rent control, right? It's, rents are rising astronomically. And while rents, right, have always historically risen, that's just kind of how things go. The rate at which they've risen in the past, just a couple of years, never mind past decade, right, has been astronomical. Right, Boston is now the second most expensive rental market in the country. We're not far off from number one. New report just came out that said Massachusetts as a whole is the third most expensive rental state in the country. Along with that gap report, they put out this, here's the hourly rate that you would need to make in Massachusetts in order to afford a standard 2-bedroom. I think it's something like $43 an hour is what you'd have to make to afford to live in Massachusetts. And guess what? Our minimum wage is 15. And so, right, the vast majority of people are not making $42 an hour. And so rent control, I want to be clear, nothing that I'm going to talk about here, no one policy is a silver bullet. No one thing is going to solve the housing crisis. And I even think, taking a step back, right, we throw around this term housing crisis. There was a really good article put out by the Center for like Othering and Belonging, right, really breaking down where they said, right, we say this word housing crisis, but it's really 13 different crises, right? And it's broken down to like an affordable housing crisis, exclusionary zoning, the rental crisis, all this other stuff. And so, right, no one policy is going to fix the housing crisis because we don't have just one housing crisis. And so when we talk about rent control, right, that's kind of like the we've got to stop the bleeding now, right? Like that's the triage. It's like people are losing their homes now because year to year, the market is allowing for their landlords to have outrageous rent increases, right?
And that's one of the things I like to mention about rent control for people who maybe don't quite understand what we're talking about is that, if you think that your landlord should not be able to double your rent the next time your lease comes up, then you believe in rent control. Right? Like rent control simply means that there is a limit. There's a limit somewhere. And the rent control bill at the State House only means that any city can decide to pass it. It doesn't mean that everybody has it. It doesn't mean that, like your rents can't be raised. It simply means there's an option. And a lot of these are, enabling legislation that allow cities to choose this if it is right for them. And then even at that point, it simply sets a limit. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a low limit.
Yeah, and so that's a really interesting point because, right, connecting it back to the HDIP and especially the debate around Senator Eldridge's amendment to require some affordability in HDIP, right? What we heard from many, many senators that got up on the Senate floor was we can't use this policy as a one-size-fits-all. Just because affordability requirements would work in this place doesn't mean they're going to work in this place. You have to allow us the flexibility to address this problem in the way that we want. And it's like, okay, cool. Same thing for rent control. Same thing for transfer fee. Yes. Same thing for TOPA. And we'll get into those other ones right away. It's like you can't have it both ways. You can't say that we can't have a blanket affordability requirement because we have to be flexible for each individual city and town, and then say, no, we can't pass enabling legislation for rent control and allow those same cities and towns to have their own say in what they want to do around housing. Right. And so like there's this massive disconnect, but and so like you said, the rent control, I think people hear rent control and have these like really kind of flashbacks to what they see from like watching Friends and right their rent control unit where their rent never got to be increased, and that's how they all got to live in these really big things. And people get really nervous about that. These are not those rent control policies. That's not what we're talking about, right? That's why you'll more often hear the term rent stabilization, because we're really not controlling rents, right? The bill that I'm working on, right, would set a max at 5%. And there are plenty of people that I work with, and I don't disagree, that even think 5%, a 5% increase is too high.
And that's 5% above the 9% current inflationary rate, right?
Yes. Well,
it's 5
plus. The mayor's proposal is CPI plus 6.
Ours
is a cap at 10.
I think the bill is the 5% just overall.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Well,
yeah, it's like Mark. It's like CPI plus a number capped at 5.
Yes. Right? There's a few different rent control proposals.
Sorry, there's a few different of them. I was like, it's not just the mayor's. There's like the mayor's was 10% plus CPI to be clear. So the mayor's wasn't even that.
Yeah. So the mayor's is 10%. There's another one that really doesn't set any parameters. And then there's the one that I'm working on in
Sorry.
conjunction with the Homes for All Coalition that does have that pretty strict 5%. Well, it's actually CPI with a cap at 5%.
By the way, my rent went up 10% each year for the last 2 years. Just so you know.
Which is not uncommon.
It's lease renewal season in the greater Boston area. And I can't tell you how many friends of mine have come to me and said, my landlord is raising my rent by this outrageous amount. What do I do?
Yeah.
And I'm like, there really isn't anything you can do. My boyfriend last year had to move out of his apartment in Somerville because the rent was being raised by $1,000.
Oh my God.
And they weren't doing any renovations. Nothing was getting fixed. They were just like, the market will allow for this. So
I think it's also, I want to say also, just to put some more numbers on it, to the number you said with $42 an hour, that's roughly it's 87,000 plus change. So it's about $88,000 a year you would have to make to have enough to afford basic rent in Massachusetts. 88,000. That puts you in the top 60% earners. That means that 60% of all people in Massachusetts make less than that. That means 60% of Massachusetts residents are currently renting at something they can't afford. So that's like, you know, so when we say affordability, and then majority of the so-called, I think it's really important because there's so much racism underpinning a lot of the opposition to these housing policies, even though, again, when people hear that, they bristle and they think, well, my rep's not racist. I'm not saying they're racist. I'm saying that they're swimming in a soup of racism. And there is an understanding of what affordability is. When they hear affordable units, what they hear is unwashed Black and brown masses. That's what they hear. And while that underpinning is super racist, I think it's also important to unpack that when most of these, when they talk an affordable unit in Worcester, that's the affordable rate is 80%. So the majority, because affordability is so unhinged and so detached from regular people's income, affordability is roughly about, again, it's actually about that same part. It's about 88,000 is what's considered affordable in Massachusetts. You make 88,000. 80% of the people in my city make less than that. So it's unaffordable, even the affordable housing for the majority of people who live here, right? And they're saying that they can't have the flexibility to require even that. That's how detached what we're talking about. I think it's really important because people hear building and rent and they just think, oh, it's going to be reasonable. The market will figure it out. No. I mean, maybe eventually 10, 15 years from now, but without any sort of guardrails, which you would never do for any other marketplace, but somehow we agree to do for this. It is totally out of step with the people who live here, the people who, it's just totally out of step for them. And underpinning that is the idea of who it would be keeping in these downtowns, right? It's the idea that if we don't do this, if we don't force people out of these downtowns, then it'll continue to be Black, brown, and poor.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, right, that's why rent control is really important. A couple other things that I'll, kind of quickly run through to help people, stay in their homes now, some things that we find really important: access to counsel, right? So when you think about navigating the eviction process, right, your rent getting to a point where you can't afford it is, right, the first step, right? And then it's, I can't afford it. What happens? Your landlord tries to evict you. Now, what we know is that what we think we know, this is a hard thing to quantify, but right, the vast majority of people that get evicted from their home do not go through the formal eviction process, right? But for the ones that do, they have this massive deck stacked against them. Housing court is confusing. The law is confusing. And even in a state like Massachusetts, where we are more renter friendly than a lot of other places, right? Which does not mean we are renter friendly. Right. This is a relative thing. Right. We are better than other places. There are still so many steps and procedures that you need to know how to do and exactly how to do them to even assert the rights that you legally have. And so we have a situation in Massachusetts where over 90% of landlords are represented by lawyers in eviction proceedings, but less than 10% of tenants are. Right. In some areas, that's even worse. So it's this massive power imbalance that is happening. And so, right, access to counsel really is just this idea that for relatively speaking, not that much more money, right? Providing legal representation for everybody that is going through the eviction process. Because what you see, right, and they've passed this in New York and other places, and what you see is when you have legal representation, the outcome of your cases is so much, like astronomically better. Right? In New York, after they implemented this, what they call right to counsel, we're calling access to counsel here, right? Overnight, I think it was like 86% of cases end in, right, what they call like favorable terms, right? And that can mean lots of things, but right, that percentage is so much less.
Wow.
When you don't have counsel, because it's confusing. I am a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for a number of years now. And there's still stuff every single time I'm in housing court, I have to learn something new about this very complicated process. And so access to counsel is really, really important. And then the quick other thing that's related to that is really important to note is eviction record sealing. It is such a travesty that we don't have eviction record sealing because, right, evictions are a policy failure, right? Let's start there. And so you have this policy failure. You've been evicted because we've allowed the rental market to get to the point where it is that you are in a position to be evicted. And now we're saying you have a permanent record that cannot be erased, that any landlord can come and look at. And I want to be clear, that's not even if you've just lost your eviction case. The second your landlord files an eviction against you, even if you go through the process, even if the process doesn't go any further, if you go through the process and the judge says this was an illegal eviction, the apartment is yours, landlord, you're bad, how could you do this evil, nasty thing? You still have that record, and it is there forever.
It is crazy. One of the things I think about with this is just how much, sorry, Jonathan, did you want to jump in before I do for 1 second?
I think that's always jarring to me is how like even children get the eviction records.
Oh my
just
God.
that component of that is always one thing that just feels especially jarring to me, that like they come to actually note that like even if you win in court, that stays with you. Like it's bad for anybody because it's like it exacerbates the underlying like housing insecurity that would lead to an eviction and like that kind of economic insecurity, but that it's just fundamentally bizarre that even if you win or if you're a child, that somehow makes you less likely to be able to get housing in the future.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, I've had to multiple times. Like I remember vividly the first time I had to have this conversation. I was in housing court. I was there for lawyer for a day, so there to help people that didn't have lawyers. And this woman walked up to me and said, "Hey, I've been served with this notice to quit for an amount of money that I know that I don't owe. What do I do?" And right, also she had claims of, right, she thinks that she got the notice to quit because of retaliation for her joining a tenants union, right, which is absolutely illegal. It's illegal to retaliate. It's not illegal to join a tenants union. Join a tenants union, to be clear.
To be clear.
But right, it's illegal to retaliate. And so as she's explaining this to me, that right, she's gotten what is likely an improper notice to quit. That is the start of a retaliation case, right? A case that, assuming all the facts that she gave me were correct, she would absolutely go to court and win. But I had to have the real conversation with her that you could go to court, you could win on a retaliation case, you win 3 months rent, you get treble damages. But if you let this eviction be filed, it will be on your record forever. And so it had to be a real conversation with her, is like, the way to get rid of this so that an eviction is not filed is if you pay the amount that's in this notice to quit, this goes away.
Oh my God.
Right. And of course, I'm not going to advise her to do that, but I have to seriously let her know that those are her options.
That is insane. And one of the other things I think about with this basic concept of like this eviction is available to the landlords to see forever is that we don't get to see anything about the landlords, right? Who knows what's happening to those landlords? They might have had horrible black mold. They might have been breaking the law. They might have had broken toilets and, no stove and who knows what. They could have had all these horrible things happen in the apartment. And you would never know as a renter. They get to see your credit rating. They get to, they get to ping your credit rating, right? Which is not great for your credit rating. They get to have so much information about you. And we do not get to have any information about them. And they are the ones in power. I mean, it is completely backwards, the level of information that should be available. We should be making information available about the people in power who are literally going to be able to control your life for years. And we should have that information available to those of us who rent, who really are not in power, in positions of power, and are putting our lives, in these people's hands. That's the way I look at it. And I think there are many other ways that we can push this forward in terms of getting, not just sealing evictions, but getting more information to tenants about landlords.
I think the other piece I just want to say really quickly to that is one of the ways that they pushed this narrative, and they have done this really successfully, is they trot out landlords like myself, right? I own my 3-decker and I live in my 3-decker, and to hear people talk about it, these laws are just onerous on me, right? These people, and they trot the me's out, but I'll tell you honestly, not only do none of these policies they almost always exempt me. Even if they didn't, they would literally never affect me. I've never raised rent more than, we barely raised rent in the years we've been here. So not only do they literally never affect me, because I think the other piece is that like a lot of these protections would protect us, the smaller folks, the folks, right? So, the predatory is the thing that's so frustrating, is like, we had to get the federal government to, again, dip into this marketplace and have some rules of the road about who could own certain properties that had come into federal possession. That's the only way that we could buy in Worcester, because Worcester's market is almost solely owned by a few large landowners who are basically corporations who act like single family homeowners, and get all the tax write-offs of single family homeowners, but they own 60 to 80% of the stock in the city of Worcester, just a few hands. And so I think it's really important, because that's how they sort of like break us apart. And I always joke, I get all the landlord emails, and then I show up and testify against the things they're complaining about, from the perspective that, like, actually rent control would be great for me, because I don't want displacement across the street from me, and it's happening all the time. Like, I get to know my neighbors and they disappear. They know my kid, they look out for me, and then they're gone. Right? Displacement hurts me, the landlord, because it destabilizes my community and the people I get to know. And instead, I have people who don't fix up their buildings, who don't do any investment, who live not in this state, who don't care. They raise it by $1,000 and don't care. And me, who lives here, who cares, who doesn't raise rent, has destabilized neighborhood around him. So, like, these policies are bad, and we don't do a good job I just want to say that really clearly, because legislators love to trot me out and do nothing to help me.
And if I may, before we go on, I am going to do the thing that I always get reminded to do, which is to say, talking about, all of these housing policies, you're not going to hear this level of detail. You're not going to hear these progressive experts in any other place. So this is really the podcast where you can hear all this information in one place. We would love to have your donation. You want to put in $5 a week, skip a cup of coffee, give it to us. And none of it goes to the people that you see on the screen, right? All of it goes to some wonderful young artists who do our graphics for us. They do the video editing for us. They cut a lot of clips, and we get all that stuff up in various places on all the different social media channels. So there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that is happening to get the word out, to increase the number of people who hear these voices. So the link is below. And now I am going to pass it right back to Mark. Especially, I would love for you to talk about one of my favorite policies, which is TOPA. It's super wonky, but the tenant's opportunity to purchase, which, can really keep people in their homes the moment that they, might get evicted or kicked out because a home is being sold. And give them some details about this one, because this is one of my favorites.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to quickly, just because Jordan said something, so I just want to quickly touch on another bill that is important, because I think they kind of get forgotten in this, is we have a foreclosure mediation bill as well, right? Homeowners get left out a lot because people think homeowners and think landlord. And that's not the case, right? That is not the case in a lot of places. And I think especially in Eastern Mass, it's easy to just think of like, no one I know is a homeowner. I'm from Western Mass, born and raised, right? And so when we talk about the 2008, housing crisis, when we're out here in Boston, it's really easy to think that like those were days far gone. where there are large swaths of Western Mass that never recovered from the 2008 housing crisis before they got hit with the pandemic. And so what our foreclosure mediation bill does, it's really simple. It simply requires lenders to sit down with borrowers before they can actually foreclose. Just sit down to talk about the options to avoid foreclosure. It doesn't create new programs. It doesn't designate more money. It just says, sit down, have a conversation to see if we can avoid a foreclosure. It's a very simple, very straightforward bill as far as I'm concerned, because whether you rent your home or own your home, I don't think you should be displaced, and you should be able to keep a roof over your head. Now, TOPA, yes, a really fun one to talk about, just because I think it doesn't get as much attention, but I think it's a really cool concept. So TOPA, otherwise known as the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, sometimes referred to as the right of first refusal. Right, and it's a way to preserve, right, what we call naturally affordable housing, right? Because we do a lot of talk about the production of housing that we need, right? How many new units we need to produce, and we absolutely do. But the thing that doesn't get talked about a lot is the number of units that we lose every year, right? The number of affordable homes that we lose every year. And so you can build as many units if you want. If you're not protecting what we already have, right, this is basic math, right, then you're not actually adding what you say you're adding, right? You can say, we built 80,000 new units this year, but if we lost 40,000, then where are we really at? And so what this bill does is essentially provides tenant associations the opportunity to purchase their building if their landlord is selling, right? It doesn't force a sale, nothing like that. All that it means is if you are in a building, generally it's going to be a larger building, and your landlord says, hey, we're selling, they have to give you all as tenants the opportunity to purchase that property. A couple of quick caveats there, because when I say this to a lot of people, they're like, who can afford to do that, right? Especially out here in Eastern Massachusetts. One, right, this bill often, right, versions of this bill, and certainly the one that we have here in Massachusetts, also allows these tenant associations to assign their rights to nonprofits, so like CDCs or community development corporations, to be able to purchase the property on their behalf, and again, keep it affordable. And if, the tenants are able to get it, right, they create what's then known as a limited equity co-op, right, which is just an opportunity where you are an owner, right? You own a piece of that building that you live in. Now, it's not the wealth building opportunity that people tell you home ownership is, which I've got a lot of feelings about, but that might be for a different podcast. But right, it gives you control, right? It gives you control. It allows, right, you to have stability in your cost of living, right? Once you own it, they can't jack up your rent, right? They can't increase your cost of living. And so you own that. And so successful programs like this have been run in DC around creating, right, a good number of these co-ops, right, which does, right, it maintains community control. It, like I said, maintains what we call naturally affordable housing. So likely, right, like units that weren't charging crazy over market rate already, and then they want to sell because they kind of, they're done, they don't want to own, or they just want to make a profit, right? It gives tenants the opportunity to have that ownership stake, to, like I said, preserve affordable housing, preserve people in their homes, and maybe even, build up a little bit of equity, if that's something.
And while you're saying that it doesn't allow for the kind of equity that like purchasing a single family or something, or a multifamily does, it's still better than renting, right? So when you're renting, you're not building anything, you're not building any equity.
Oh, absolutely.
And so it's and you can stay in your home. So for people who like have kids and their kids are in the school system, and they'd have to disrupt their entire lives, like this is a really good option for a lot of people who might live in these tenant associations.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think TOPA is great. It got to the governor's desk a couple of sessions ago, and Charlie Baker vetoed it, and it was too late in the session for an override. So we're hoping it makes it back. And again, this is another bill. It's a local option. This does not require or force anybody to adopt this policy, right? It may not make sense for some places to adopt that policy. It may not be a thing that works. But we're allowing it. And then the last kind of tidbit of what we want to allow municipalities to do, right? I'd be remiss if I did not mention the transfer fee, right? To kind of to circle it back to the building of affordable housing, right? I think we all probably saw the report that the median price for a home, was it either in Greater Boston, was it Massachusetts as a whole? It might have been Greater Boston, right? Is now $900,000. an obscene amount of money,
Crazy.
right? And so that's not even just, so on one hand, it's an obscene amount of money to be able to have to purchase it, but it's also an obscene amount of money that you are making off the sale of that purchase, right? And so what a local option, again, local option, nobody's required to do this. What a local option transfer fee would do is be for high-end real estate transactions, the version of the bill that I work on, that means over $1 million, a municipality can set a transfer fee, right? So a fee of 0.5% to a max of 2% on those high-end real estate transactions to fund affordable housing, right? And I think beyond just this idea of like, oh, let's, tax the rich, right? It really is actually a direct causal link, right? The reason why neighborhoods become so unaffordable, right, is because of the speculation in the housing market. It's because of people buying, sitting on it, flipping it a year or two later for way more money, right? Which then drives up home values and therefore cost of living for everybody in the neighborhood. And so all that a transfer fee does is say for the people that are driving the problem and directly profiting off of it, we just want to take a tiny amount of that so we can build some housing so that the people that you're pushing out don't get pushed out. Right? I think it's a pretty reasonable thing. And again, to just trace it back to the HDIP arguments of we can't require affordability across the board because what works here isn't going to work there. Fine. If that's the argument we're going to go with, it's not an argument that I buy into when it comes to HDIP. Everywhere needs affordable housing. But if that's the argument that y'all are going to go with to justify not putting any type of affordability requirements on HDIP, then the same logic has to apply for something like a transfer fee.
Absolutely.
Like it has to.
Yeah. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. Really great to talk about housing, such an important issue here all over the place in Massachusetts. And Mark, thank you so much for your expertise. Thanks to everybody for listening, and we will see you all next week. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. And it would be amazing if you would also subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. Just look for Incorruptible Massachusetts wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.